Hi guys, welcome back to the Butterfly Effect podcast. I'm your host Liam. I'm going to mix it up a little bit today. Jack, how are you doing?
I'm good, mate. Thanks for asking.
There we go. It's been a year and I've never asked, and I thought I should shake it up a little bit. So today guys, we are going to be doing a ranking video. We did the prologue one a while back for the season 1 of the Dark Picture Anthology games, and now we thought we'd just get the main games out of the way. So we'll be ranking Man of Medan, Little Hope, House of Ashes, and The Devil in Me, and Jack and I will be giving medals to the ones we like best.
Okay, so for me, Man of Medan finishes at the bottom of the pile, and I think the main reason for this is because of the pacing of this game. Even now, I think that it takes too long for all of the characters to get to the boat, which is where the real horror starts to come in. And as we mentioned in the other video, I just found the twist to be too predictable. You know, there's this gas everywhere. And I actually remember when I did my first blind playthrough, I overthought the twist. I was thinking, right, it's this gas. But then I found some clues about like the water system. And I was like, is it something to do with the water? And it's like, no. We literally got told it within the first 5 minutes of the game starting. What I would say though is sort of like positives. You know, I think that it's a decent cast of characters. I like Conrad. I like Brad. I think Bliss, Julia, Alex fall into that middle of the range to lower tier for me. But I absolutely adore the setting for this game. I think it's really one of its strengths. It's a classic ghost ship, and I actually wish that it did have ghosts on it. I wish that it is what it set out to do, because the fact that it was this whole hallucination thing takes away those moments for me where Conrad has the sailor woman over his shoulders, and I suppose as the player we're thinking, wait, does that mean one of the crew was stood right behind him? Because what it implies is that everything you see is an actual person, but it's like they're sort of framed as something else. So that was a little bit confusing. I think another good thing as well, it's actually fairly good for replayability. You know, I think there's a good middle section of the game where it can be completely different due to your certain choices. Especially in Curator's Cut, you can have this moment with Brad and he's with Fliss and the room starts filling up with water, and you know, one of them can potentially drown. Of course, you have the ending as well. If it goes a certain way, Conrad and Olsen can break out into a fight, and of course Conrad can die with the big metal door shutting down on him. So there is good stuff there, but I think for me the where it falls down is perhaps its story. At the end of the day, it needed to have genuine horror and it needed to be a little bit less predictable.
Right, so I've given Man of Medan the bronze medal, so Man of Medan falls third for me. I'll start off with the positives. Like Jack said, I absolutely love the ghost ship setting. I don't know what it is, but there's something really creepy about hearing the metal clanging, the sounds in the background, the jump scares that go on while you're in this metallic, tight-knit, claustrophobic space. I really like the theme. I felt this game, was one of the ones that offered probably the most endings. I like the fact that Conrad can, go away and then come back at the end to an abandoned ship. There's the one where there's the army cover-up ending, which is really dark. Or you can just simply have all the survivors get off the ship and, go away free, which is quite nice. It's very varied, which I really like. Albeit I did find the ending very abrupt. I thought the characters were better than the one I'm going to rank fourth. Although I will admit that some of them are still very much sea level, which I'll dip into later. I thought that the game benefited massively from the fact that you had a wider cast with the pirates on board with you. With the characters, we had Junior, who you could save. You had this really epic character in Conrad. I thought he was quite obnoxious, but it really worked. He stood out, and I think he's a very memorable Supermassive Games character. And if Julia rejects Alex's proposal, I actually think their dynamic becomes more interesting and the game's a lot better if you do that. because it renders them quite tense and they have a few bickers on the ship, and that bleeds into the story pretty well. Like I mentioned before, the horror element might be one of the strongest of these 4 games. The jump scares that happened, being claustrophobic in the tight hallways, really engaging stuff. I really liked the hallucination monsters, whether we're talking about the Sailor Girl, the Alex Stubble, the rats, even Fliss, when Conrad thinks he's someone else. Fliss chasing Conrad down the hallways, really creepy villain there. One reason I put this 3rd instead of 4th is I felt the choices mattered more, and there's more variety. You could have the fight scene with Olsen, but you could have multiple characters in that, in those shoes instead. I really like the fact, like you mentioned, Jack, you've got the drown sequence. You can have Conrad on the ship or not on the ship. Even Olsen, he can die from a heart attack, or he can have the epic fight scene at the end. Where this game falls down for me is the fact, like you mentioned, the twist is just way too predictable. I sussed on from the prologue, and it made the game a little bit tedious because you kind of knew what was coming. Like I mentioned before, I felt the characters were still sea level, and the characters get better in other games. I mentioned the fact I like Conrad, but everyone else is either a C, D, or, like a really awful grade. Alex, Flish just don't do all that much for me. And I don't know, I think there's a giant gulf between 2 of these Dark Picture Anthology games versus the other 2, and unfortunately, Man of Medan falls in the kind of lower tier ones. The final strike against this game is, I think it suffers dramatically from pacing. Like you mentioned, it takes them a while to get on the ship, and even when they do get on the ship, there are moments that drag. I have replayed this game, and one of the sections I found the most tedious was the scuba diving section. It went on for way too long, and when I replayed it, I just really didn't enjoy the scene at all, which is why Man of Medan gets the bronze medal for me. So Little Hope, unfortunately for me, falls bottom. For me, it is the worst game out of the 4. There are a few positives I like about it. If you watch the prologue video, you'll know me and Jack sing really high praises on the prologue. I thought the prologue was arguably one of the best, and I love the way it affects the main games, especially the whole thing about how Tanya dies affects what monster Taylor has to deal with later on. I thought the game did a really good job of capturing the different eras. Whether, you've got Abraham in the really old school video, whether you've got the 70s family with the vinyls and, the shaggy haircuts, or if it's just the modern day one, I thought the eras were captured really tremendously. Although I'll go into the twist and how I wasn't the best fan of it later on, I do find some elements of the twist enjoyable, such as when you look back at moments such as how Vince was speaking to just one person, and you could see that Andrew was clearly by himself, and there were a few breadcrumbs there which I thought were done really well. I really like the monsters. There's just a nice variety of them, and they are really creepy. And if you're a big fan of Silent Hill, I can really see you enjoying this game. The misty roads, there's some similarities there which Little Hope has going for it. Where I strike it massively for me, there's a few bullet points here, from the slow moments to Will Poulter's performance, which I won't slate too much because I've done that in previous episodes, where I just expected more out of a mainstay actor such as Will Poulter. I think it's harmed massively from the fact they threw another fake out ending at us, and I remember us going into House of Ashes really scared that they were going to do it 3 times in a row. Maybe that's not Little Hope's fault, maybe it's the fact it came after Man of Medan, but I do think it betrayed my investment of playing this game for 2 hours. I didn't massively buy into the trauma and the psychotic episode element. It almost seemed a little unrealistic, especially when Daniel and Taylor can break off and this guy's not only imagining, different characters which are now fictional, but he can also imagine himself time traveling, and then there's supernatural elements and monsters. It just seems a little over the top for me for the twist, and I'm not sure I buy the ending that much. I've slated it before for this, but the linear nature really got to me. I just really got fed up of all the walking down the dark roads. It just seems a lot of the time what they're doing is bumbling into a house, then leaving, and then going into another house where very mundane things happen for me. I felt the characters were the bleakest. I've been very vocal before about how I actually preferred the prologue family, the Clarks. we all know I hate Daniel. You've got Taylor. I don't think Angela and John and Andrew did all that much for me. I think John's probably the best character for me, and even then I would say he's C standard. I think, the characters really fall below the mark for me. I've mentioned it before as well, but I did this game mode on movie night mode, and the movie night mode was so broken. It wouldn't often tell you to switch controllers to the next person, so I had my mate doing my characters for me, losing them, and it wasn't my fault kind of thing. And it felt very broken, and I think it's something that has massively improved throughout. And the final thing I have to slate is that chase scene. It's just god awful with like slow-mo shots, then back into normal shots, and it almost feels like the monster's on their tail, but then like it's really far in the background, and it just felt really out of place and poorly executed. Little Hope, I enjoyed the game, but for me, it falls below the mark and it doesn't get a medal.
Interesting. So for me, Little Hope finished third on my list. And before I go into my reasoning, I have to honestly come back to what you said for Man and Medan, mate. If I was basing this list on just on how objective, in terms of a choice-based game, I'll be absolutely with you. Man and Medan has some fantastic choice and variation in there. I suppose, honestly, looking at this list for me, I'm almost basing it mostly on my blind playthrough, how invested I was. And I think the reason why Little Hope finishes third for me is because of that. I think it's a really interesting story premise. You don't know how the bus driver's connected. You don't know how this whole family fire fits in. You've got these doppelganger monsters that are chasing their counterparts. You've got this fog that's pressing them further and further into the town. There's just so many pieces to put together, and it really sort of requires some detective work, and it really just kept me invested from the start. Whereas I think Man and Medan, it really wasn't until you got on the ghost ship that the story kicked in. As far as the ending goes, I thought that the ending was actually not that bad of an ending in terms of if you're doing a single playthrough. If you were literally playing this game once, you might sit there and think, okay, it's talk about mental health and trauma. There's little details in there that allude to this throughout the game. The fact that when he goes back in time, the faces of the people that are in these sort of witch segments actually relate to faces that he remembers from his childhood. So, for example, I'm talking about the Asian man that runs into Anthony when he's holding the matchsticks. He then appears as the judge in his vision, because I think it's ultimately him that lobs Anthony into the police, which I think is such an interesting thing on a mental level. As Liam said, I absolutely adore the prologue. It's honestly, it peaks very early, this game, for me. And also the fact, the use of the elements, you have the use of the water with each of the demons. You can have the use of fire, the use of earth, and the use of air. And I thought that was just brilliantly it wasn't necessarily fed to the player, but upon closer inspection you can see these elements, and you can see that there was a great attention to detail there. For me, it's just such a shame, because I feel like this game had so much potential. I almost wish that when we had these whole introduction of witches, that they did go with witches to an extent, because I do think that Little Hope suffers because it follows Man of Medan and the fact they have the same twist. Whenever I hear people criticising this game, it is to do with, it's in his head again. Whereas I feel like if this game was sat on its own and Man of Medan didn't come before, I don't think people would come down on it as harshly. Having said that, there are negatives to this game. And for me, because of this twist, it sucks for replayability. You wander around these environments and you think, there are some clues that are relevant. Other clues you're thinking, wow, because it's all in this guy's head, it's completely redundant, and so it doesn't really give you an impetus to go back and play this game again. And as Liam touched on as well, it's too linear. I mean, I completed this game obviously for the 100%, and you're playing a lot of the same scenes over and over and over again, and it starts to drive you a bit mad. So it does come down on that sense. And I think as well that the characters and setting were bland. I did like the whole fog element, but you are literally just walking down a road for most of this game. There's the odd building and thing that you can go into, but I just wish that all of these buildings were almost like closer together, and it was almost like a little village sort of thing rather than just one long road. As for the characters, yeah, they're too bland. It was a bit disappointing on behalf of Will Poulter, really. I liked John, I liked Angela. Again, I have to agree that they're not top tier characters, they're good characters. And then the rest I think are just quite forgettable. But I will give it praise that they did mix up the age ranges in this particular game. One last thing I'd like to add as well is that we did do a video based on Man and Medan versus Little Hope. It was one of our first videos on this channel. If you do want to have a more sort of deeper discussion and listen to what our thoughts were back then click the link in the description. Okay, so the game that gets the silver medal for me is House of Ashes. So let's get all of the positives as usual out the way first. For me, I really liked the ending. I think the final third is where this game really comes into its own, and it's where I sort of started to pay a bit more attention to it. You've burrowed into the earth, you've then gone down this lift, and there's this massive space, this massive arc from this ship that's crashed. You see this gigantic cocoon. I know it's just me that thinks this, but when you start to see the bats start to come out of their little eggs and cocoons and scutter their way down, I don't know, there's just something that was really repulsive about that for me, and I thought, oh, this is brilliant, you know, especially having two games where it was all in their head. To have a physical threat in this game was really welcome. I think that there's a solid cast of characters in this game, arguably the best in all of Season 1. And I'm just talking about the main five and the bonus here. I thought Merwin and Clarice really did well to add to the main five. I liked the fact that there was a relationship dynamic between Eric and Rachel. I think that was more believable than Mark and Kate in The Devil in Me. And then, of course, Nick was a little bit bland, but then you've got Jason and Salim, and I think they're both popular characters in the community as well. In terms of the setting, I think where it starts to come down for me, I mean, you are in caves, and obviously this is part of the game. But I think, for me, it really was until they got to the Ark and you got all these sort of luminescent green colours, and it was just a little bit more alien-like that I really started to take appreciation of it. Whereas I think what, you know, my number one choice did a bit better is that you did sort of start to see various locations throughout the game. You're not just sort of seeing caves throughout the most of it. I love the fact that they introduced these video-based clues. You know, it's all I'm all for reading. I don't mind reading the clues, but I think that they introduced this whole archaeological dig background through a video format. I thought was a very welcome thing, and again, it's just an innovative feature that they've added into these games. I like the monsters themselves, and I like the backstory when you have that whole thing with Rachel when she sees the ship crash to Earth. Admittedly, on a slight downer, did somewhat predict in the early stages in my blind playthrough that they would be vampire-like. I mean, of course, they're not vampires, they're parasites, but as soon as I saw the claw and it didn't like the sunlight, the fact that they were bats, I was like, yeah, this is going to be based off vampires. But what I would like to say is that, and I think this actually achieves this better than The Quarry, might be a bit controversial, but I really like the fact that you get to see the characters turn into these vampires, quote unquote, and you still see their faces. You know, you can see Rachel and Clarice, like the little horns come out of their head and they're moving really agile, whereas obviously with The Quarry, they're just, you know, they're fully transformed into werewolves, obviously a completely different creature, but I feel like the House of Ashes ones did it more for me in some way. I think in terms of the negatives, there was glitches in places. I think maybe Liam might go into this a little bit, but you can get characters stuck. There's a bits in places where it's a little bit unrealistic. Again, you could level this most of the game, but Dar's looking for Eric and Rachel, I think, down in the cave. They're making so much noise and this guy doesn't know where they are. I'm thinking, like, come on, mate, like, they're literally right round the corner. And I think as well, for me personally, I didn't think the prologue was the best, especially when you think about Curator's Cut. It just, for me, when I think of that prologue, I think of them walking down some low-lit hallways, chatting to one another. So maybe that's a bit of bias on my part, but nonetheless, I can't really look past it.
So, mate, I haven't told you my rankings. If you had to predict if I was putting House of Ashes first or second, what would you guess I would give it?
You know what? Early doors, I'd have said you'd have put it second, like me. But I think the more we've been doing Devil in Me videos, I think you've switched, and I think that you've put it first.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's dead close, guys. For me, these games are pretty equal. But I gave it a lot of thought, and I've given House of Ashes the silver medal.
Ooh.
So, I mean, the first thing to mention is, I mean, I love the amount of layers you have, like from the prologue where you've got Balathu and Kurim, the Arcadians against the Gutians, and then you've got the war with the Americans versus the Iraqis, and then, like you say, you've got these vampire bat creatures, and then they go even deeper, and then the color palette changes again, and you've got aliens involved. I just think, you know, the game just has a lot going for it, and it's just nicely divided up. I felt the characters were like the most enjoyable, you know, out of the first 3 games anyway. Even the side ones, they threw a load of new people at us, such as Clarice, Star, Merwin, Joey, and they all brought something to the game as well. They weren't just background fodder. For example, there's a whole achievement about making Merwin fix the radio. Clarice has this choice that bleeds massively into the game, and even like Joey, you get to see him turn. It's all fantastic. Like you mentioned as well, the Hodgson Expedition videos, just a really fantastic addition, which, you know, I think is going to be a main staple for these games now, considering that the Devil in Me did it. The fact that we would get, you know, visual footage and we get to watch these mini movies, it's just a nice way of breaking the gameplay up, I thought, and it's just a fantastic addition. I have to mention as well, I always mention this, for me it might be the most beautiful game in terms of how stunning the temple was with the eclipse, the prologue villain's outfit, and I think it was the most unique color palette as well. You know, we mentioned in the other video that the first 2 games brought this very moody, bluey green feel to it, but the color palette was very similar in many ways. But with this game, suddenly we have this like golden kind of deserty feel about it, and it just looks phenomenal. I loved the amount of endings this game threw at us. There were a lot of varied ones as well, such as Salim leaving with the guys or going off to see his son. You've got like the really dark one as well, where Rachel can go in the cocoon and she can get saved or just abandoned there in a fate that is worse than death, which, you know, is completely true. There's just a lot of choices in this game as well, whether it's shooting the shepherd and it perceives how Salim sees Jason, whether Clarice gets the rope or not, and that massively affects the game, whether Eric can die later on, what you do with the landmines in the hallway when you're trying to trap everyone. And then you've got the massive choice as well from the prologue, whether you can have Kurim or Balathu as your main villain, while the other one ends up cocooned. I thought that's just really dark, but also really cool how the prologue can have this much ripple effect. I also have to mention that I think it might have one of the most beautiful scenes and one of the most amazing scenes in the game, where Rachel's wading through the river of blood almost, and it just looked absolutely phenomenal. It's one of my favorite shots of the series. Of course, I've given it the silver medal, so it's, you know, not without its downfalls, and I'll talk about why it got silver more when I praise the other game. But I think we have to mention, don't we, mate, it's probably got the weakest curator scenes. We mentioned it before, but I thought Man of Medan and Little Hope did a very good job of you know, bringing the curator in, having him say all his lines, and then the Devil in Me, we got a mini conclusion, albeit we've mentioned we wanted more. But House of Ashes, the 3rd installment of these games, the curator just didn't really do that much, and it was a bit of a bummer. You mentioned glitches before. Yeah, I will go into them. It's a bit of a downer on my blind playthrough that I had to restart the game twice or back out into the menu, turn my console off and then go back in. Because, yeah, I suffered from the glitch we mentioned where Jason traps Salim in the cell and you just can't get out. I know there are tutorials online about how you can get around this by kind of wading your way through for 8 minutes, but I'm not going to sit there for 8 minutes, guys. I think, you know, this is a strike and it's not what I'm going to defend the game on. And I also had a clue that wouldn't let me back out, so I had to restart my console there as well. I mentioned the characters, how enjoyable they were. Obviously, you mentioned it as well. I thought Nick was probably the only weak one out of the 5, but it was certainly a massive step up in quality of the characters, especially the main 5. Nick was the only weakest one, but I'd still say he's much better than a lot of the ones from the other 2 games. And yeah, you mentioned it before, there are a lot of tedious sections in this game, a lot of them where you're just walking down dark tunnels, and like a lot of the other games, it suffers with pacing, and House of Ashes is definitely not without those moments, mate. And of course, that means we've got the same gold medal game, The Devil in Me, the most recent installment. Is it recency bias? I don't think so too much, because I really tried to consider putting House of Ashes above this one. So one thing I will mention is I think performance-wise, the strongest of the game, especially from Paul Kay playing as Charlie Lollet, who is our all-time favourite character. He absolutely smashed it. And I almost think I'm walking into Directive 8020 with a bit of sadness that we won't get to see Paul Kay again. At least I doubt it. He just brought something so different and warm to, his Charlie Lollet character, and he might be my all-time favourite Supermassive game character we've ever witnessed. Massive hats off as well to Jessie Buckley, who smashed her role, and H.H. Holmes in the prologue. Absolutely chilling roles and line delivery. These all need to be praised. There's a lot of endings in this game, and we mentioned it as well. The ultimatum ending is probably the best one. If we was to write it like a book or a movie, I would pick this ending. The fact that the cycle continues, it marries very well with the prologue. I think one big reason I put this game above House of Ashes are the new features it threw at us, whether it's the running pace, which is the big one, whether it's climbing ladders, shimmying, crawling, balance beams. There was a lot of new things going for it, and it just made the game a lot more complete. These games get criticised massively for not being strong on the gameplay front and being too heavily involved in story. And although I don't mind that, that's definitely a fantastic way to make this game a lot more inclusive, or to, hush those criticisms. I think it's just a massive step in the right direction for the Dark Picture anthologies. We always wanted faster running pace, which helps you on a replayability front as well. And this is a massive reason I put it above House of Ashes. It's just such a welcome new feature. And it's why I reckon the next 4 installments of Season 2 are probably going to get even more gold medals that are going to pit The Devil in Me for me, because it's just something I'm really looking forward to seeing how they're going to do with these new features. Are they going to add more? Are they going to improve the current ones? We'll have to see. Another praise I gave as well is the fact that it's a really challenging game. In my blind playthrough, I had 2 out of 5 when I've typically done very well with the DPA games, and I loved that I had a torrid time. I sucked at the heartbeat sequences, but it made my playthrough really unique, and it made me feel really proud that the 2 characters, Mark and Jamie, that I did manage to keep alive, that I managed to do that. Oh, and the dog, of course. It was a longer game as well. I felt a few of the endings from the other ones felt very abrupt, but it was nice that we just got more meat on the bones, if you will. So I just think that's something we have to praise The Devil in Me for. And again, I have to mention the characters. A really strong cast full of people. I thought 4 out of 5 of them are probably B or A standard. Mark was a little bland to me, but I still think he's a lot stronger than a lot of the guys you would get in, say, Little Hope or Man of Medan. Now, of course, this game isn't perfect. I voiced it before. I reckon, the bar can still be beat by the next 4 games coming out. This game does have its criticisms. I think maybe it has less endings than a few of the other games. I know you can get the ultimatum one, but otherwise it's just about whether you end up on the speedboat and who ends up at the shore. I feel like, this game is probably a lot more linear than we actually want to believe, and how much we let on. We mentioned previously as well, this game doesn't go without its few tedious sections. I found this especially from Kate and Jamie doing their little detour, walking away from Morello, and I felt some of the Mark sections with his puzzles, especially when he's with Kate in the earlier scenes, to be very tedious. I've criticised it heavily before. I think Dumet is too present, lurking in the background. I know it's not too big a criticism, but I don't know how it justifies him going from the gardens to the hotel back outside as quick as he does. I don't think the centre room is an excuse for that. It's still not without its glitches as well. I know a lot of people's blind playthroughs were absolutely ruined from the glitches, and I think that is a downfall of them maybe giving us these new features. I had the Mark Shuffle in my playthrough. I know we've mentioned it before, people didn't have QuickTime events showing up, people had texture pack problems, and certain people have even reported going outside the map, so I do think we need to flag this. And also, I know in the prologue video I said Man and Medan possibly has the weakest prologue, but I do think The Devil in Me has a pretty weak prologue as well. The characters are pretty forgettable and bleak in my opinion, and it just simply serves as a plot device to kind of go for that the cycle continues feel about it. But otherwise, yeah, absolutely strong. I think it completely justifies its gold medal.
And I think the same. So that's the end of the video, guys. So, honestly, I won't cover the same ground as leaving lots of areas, but I'll just add some things as well, because for me, Devil in Me is also first place. So I think for me, there is bias in here. The theme of it, it's obviously serial killer. It's more grounded. I love the fact as well that because of this theme and this genre, I was invested from the beginning. I mean, I've obviously been invested from all of the games at the beginning, but taking a look at, say, House of Ashes, for example, which finished second, it really was the final third. When I think about House of Ashes, I'm thinking about the final third of the game. With this game, I could be thinking at various points. It could be the lighthouse, it could be the director's suite, it could be the dinner table. Like, there's just sort of more iconic scenes littered throughout the game rather than condensed towards the end for me. Also, the deaths. The deaths in this game were fantastic, and because of the variation, I think as well some of them just had, I'm pretty sure that these, the two deaths talking about, Charlie and Erin, are one of the few, if not the only, off-screen deaths. And for some reason, like, they stand out so much to me. The fact that this guy can get accused of being an accomplice of the killer, and then he's just displayed as complicit, left to find by his crew. Erin as well, she's also killed off screen, and again displayed, the heart beating up to a monitor with the recording of her Scared song playing. I just thought it was really chilling. And you know, sometimes I think you don't need to necessarily see the death. I think it actually be more powerful not seeing the death, and then there's like some sort of reveal that a character has died, which for me personally, it really worked. I think as well, yeah, it was a longer game. It was able to breathe more, so therefore the pacing I felt was a lot better in this game. The fact that you had a bit of a blend of going indoors and outdoors. You know, I think obviously, I know House of Ashes, you start somewhat outdoors because you're going around them little huts and things, but I'm really glad in The Devil in Me that you started outside, you went into the hotel, it was very warm, very welcoming, but obviously then you had all of the, you know, the traps and things. But naturally the game progressed back to where it started again, which was the lighthouse, and I thought the symmetry in that storytelling, I thought was very well done by Supermassive there. I think one other thing as well is the fact that there's puzzle solving. Now, I love puzzle solving, so, you know, I mean, was they the absolute best? No. You know, it might be sort of, you've got to find a certain number on a wall to open a door. Of course, you have the thing with Jamie as well, where you have to sort of solve the electrics, but again, it's something different. It's something that separates itself from all of the other games for the most part. And it shows that Supermassive are starting to take steps in other directions, which for me is just really encouraging.
Fantastic, mate. So our lists are very similar. Man and Medan, Little Hope are the only denominators that, you know, have one bronze medal each. But the other games, yeah, like, it seems like our list is very similar. So Devil in Me first, House of Ashes second, Little Hope and Man and Medan sharing third place. So obviously, guys, this was our list. Let us know what your rankings are. Let us know what you thought of our opinions. Were we wrong with any of them? Are you in complete agreement with any of the other things? But we hope you enjoyed this video. Anything to mention there, Jack?
I don't think so, mate. Happy to wrap up.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining this, guys. It's really enjoyable doing these rankings. Tell us if there's any other sorts of rankings you want us to do. Maybe we should rank deaths, maybe we should rank characters. I'm unsure. Just throw your ideas at us, and we'll see you guys in the next one.
Bye bye for now.